The pale light of dawn had not yet broken the horizon, but it was enough. Enough to see the frost clinging to the fence posts, enough to see the weary breath of the cattle steaming in the corral, and enough for Jacob to see the figure moving across his land. It was a slow, determined gait, a rhythm of exhaustion that still refused to surrender. At first he thought it was a trick of the low light, a phantom born of solitude. But as the form drew nearer, it resolved into two impossible facts. It was a woman, and she was wearing a dress the color of blood against the muted winter-brown plains. He stopped his work, his hand resting on the cold wood of the fence, and waited. The silence of the vast, empty land was absolute, broken only by the crunch of her steps on the frozen earth. She was Chinese, her face pale and etched with a profound weariness, yet her dark eyes held a fire that defied the cold. Her red cheong sam, a garment of fine silk meant for a world far from this harsh expanse, was torn at the hem and stained with mud, but she wore it like armor. She stopped a few feet from him, her posture impossibly straight, a testament to a will that had carried her body past its limits. Her own breath plumed in the frigid air, mingling with his. Jacob said nothing. He was a man accustomed to the language of silence, to the subtle shifts of the weather and the quiet needs of his livestock. He had built a life here predicated on simplicity and isolation, a bulwark against the complexities of a world he had long since turned his back on. This woman was a sudden, vibrant, and dangerous complication. She looked directly at him, her gaze unwavering, and when she spoke, her voice was low and clear, stripped of all pleading, leaving only the stark weight of its meaning. "Kill me," she said, the words hanging like ice crystals in the air, "or be my husband." Jacob's weathered face remained impassive, but a deep stillness took hold of him. The ultimatum was so absolute, so devoid of artifice, that it bypassed shock and landed squarely in the realm of grim reality. The open sky seemed to press down, a silent witness to the choice she had laid at his feet. It was not a request for mercy, it was a demand for a final, irrevocable judgment. Jacob held her gaze, searching for the slightest hint of madness or deception. He found neither. What he saw was a dignity so profound it bordered on defiance, the last remaining possession of a person who had been stripped of everything else. The world was full of cruelty. He knew that better than most. He had carved out this piece of land to escape it, to live by a code that was simple and clean. Do no harm. Tend to what is yours. Expect nothing. This woman, with her impossible demand, was dragging the world's ugliness right to his doorstep. His first instinct, the one honed by years of self-preservation, was to refuse, to turn away and send her back to whatever darkness she had fled. Her fate was not his concern. He had his own burdens, his own ghosts that walked this land with him in the quiet hours. Taking on hers would be an act of profound folly, an invitation for the kind of trouble that, once it started, rarely ended well. He could see the faint bruising on her wrist, peeking from the silk cuff of her dress. He saw the way her hands were clenched into small, tight fists at her sides, a desperate effort to maintain control. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of a cornered animal, when the choice between fighting and dying becomes one and the same. To kill her was unthinkable. To marry her was madness. But to send her away, what was that if not a slower, more cruel form of the first option? He broke the silence, his voice rough from disuse. Why? It was the only question that mattered. She did not look away. Because a dead woman is free, she answered, her voice even, and a wife belongs to her husband. Either way, I will not belong to them again. The word them was freighted with a history he did not need to hear to understand. It spoke of ownership, of brutality, of a life that was not a life at all. He looked past her, at the vast, uncaring landscape that stretched to the edge of the world. It offered no guidance. The choice was his alone. He thought of the quiet order of his days, the simple peace he had fought so hard to build. He was being asked to set a match to it, all for a stranger. He let out a slow breath, the vapor obscuring her face for a moment. Then he gave a short, sharp nod, not towards her, but towards the small, sturdy cabin that stood against the immense sky. It was not an answer to her question, not a promise of marriage. It was a simpler, more immediate offer. Shelter. For now, it was enough. The inside of the cabin was as sparse and functional as the man who lived in it. A stone hearth, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, a bed built into the far wall, and shelves holding the essentials of a solitary life. The air was warm, smelling of wood smoke and coffee. For Leanne, the sudden warmth was a physical shock, a stark contrast to the biting cold that had seeped into her bones. She stood just inside the door, her body rigid, her eyes taking in every detail of the room. She was a trespasser here, an agent of chaos in this place of quiet order. She did not relax, did not allow the heat to soften the rigid line of her spine. She was a guest on borrowed time, her future still hanging on the precipice of the choice he had yet to fully make. Jacob moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. He stoked the fire, adding a log that caught with a soft whoosh of flame. He poured water from a kettle into a tin cup and placed it on the table, a silent offering. He did not hover or press her. He simply provided, then retreated to the other side of the room, giving her the gift of space. Leanne approached the table as if it were a negotiating table in a truce. She picked up the cup, her fingers trembling slightly as they wrapped around its warmth. She drank the water slowly, the simple act of mercy feeling monumental. He then placed a bowl of leftover stew and a piece of bread beside the cup. She ate with a deliberate, measured grace, her movements precise and contained. It was the careful etiquette of someone who had learned to make herself small, to take up as little space in the world as possible, yet it was imbued with an unshakable dignity. Jacob watched her from a distance, leaning against the wall. He was not studying a problem to be solved, but observing a person fighting her way back into her own skin. He saw the deep exhaustion she could no longer hide, the way her shoulders sagged slightly with every spoonful. He saw the resilience in the way she straightened them again. There was no deception in this woman. There was only a profound and terrible honesty. When she finished, she looked at him, her dark eyes questioning. The night was coming, and with it, another unspoken negotiation. He gestured to the hearth. He had already laid out a spare blanket and a pillow made from a stuffed grain sack. "You can sleep there," he said. It was a simple statement of fact. He made no move toward his own bed. He would take the chair, a silent guardian against the night. He was not her husband, not yet. He was not her captor. He was simply a man who had opened his door, and for now, that had to be the foundation of whatever was to come. Several days passed in a rhythm of shared silence. Leanne moved through the small cabin with a quiet efficiency, mending the tear in her vibrant dress with thread Jacob provided, washing the few dishes, sweeping the floor. She did not speak unless spoken to, but her presence was a constant, a splash of vivid red in his monochrome world. She was like a bird with a broken wing, resting and gathering its strength, her eyes always watchful, always aware. The quiet pact between them held. He provided shelter, and she provided a silent, unobtrusive companionship he hadn't realized he had missed. The delicate truce, however, could not exist in a vacuum. The ranch was isolated, but it was not a separate world. When the supply of flour and coffee ran low, Jacob knew he had to ride into the settlement of Prairie Creek. He saddled his horse, the creak of the leather loud in the cold morning air. Leanne watched him from the cabin doorway, her expression unreadable. She knew what a town meant. It meant eyes and questions and judgment. The ride was cold, the landscape stark and unforgiving under a gray sky. Prairie Creek was less a town and more a raw collection of wooden buildings huddled together against the vastness of the plains. As he tied his horse to the hitching post outside the general store, he felt the familiar shift in the atmosphere. The few men loitering on the boardwalk stopped their conversations, their gazes following him. He had always been an outsider, a man who kept to himself, and that bred suspicion. Inside the store, the air was thick with the smell of pickles, leather, and unspoken curiosity. "Mister?" Davies, the proprietor, a man whose face was a road map of local gossip, greeted him with a practiced smile. "Jacob, cold one today. Need to restock?" As Jacob listed his needs, flour, salt, coffee, beans, he noticed Davies adding an extra portion of everything. "Figured you might be entertaining," Davies said, his voice laced with insinuation. "Heard tell some trouble blew over from the railroad camps. A runaway." The words were casual, but they were a clear and pointed probe. Jacob's face remained a stony mask. He paid for his goods, his movements deliberate and calm. "Just a long winter," he said, his voice flat, offering no purchase for further questions. But the whispers followed him out the door, quiet and venomous. He felt their prejudice like a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that sought to define him, to define her. He had lived apart from their rules for so long, but by giving her shelter he had inadvertently placed himself and her directly under their hostile gaze. The fence lines of their small, cruel world were closing in. He rode back to the ranch with a grim set to his jaw, the town's poison clinging to him. The open land, which usually brought him a sense of peace, now felt exposed, vulnerable. He saw the thin trail of smoke rising from his cabin's chimney and felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it startled him. That fragile warmth, that small pocket of safety, was now under threat from the outside world. He found Leanne by the window, where she had clearly been watching for his return. She turned as he entered, her dark eyes searching his face. She did not need to ask. She saw the hard lines around his mouth, the way he set the supply sacks down with a heavy finality. She knew what he had faced in that town, had likely faced it 100 times herself in 100 different ways. The comfortable silence of the past few days was gone, replaced by a tense awareness of the choice that could no longer be postponed. He had brought the world's judgment back with him, and now it sat between them at the small wooden table. That evening, the fire cast long dancing shadows on the walls. Jacob sat staring into the flames, the moral calculus of his situation turning over and over in his mind. The town's reaction had not swayed him towards abandoning her. It had done the opposite. Their ugly, presumptive cruelty had clarified his own convictions. To turn her out now would not just be a failure of mercy. It would be a capitulation to their small-mindedness, an act of cowardice he knew he could not live with. He had spent his life valuing his word, his integrity, above all else. It was the bedrock of his solitude. He stood up and walked over to where she sat, mending his shirt with small, precise stitches. She looked up, her hands stilling in her lap. The flickering firelight caught the deep red of her dress, making it seem as if she were surrounded by an inner flame. He looked down at her, at the quiet strength in her face, and made his commitment, not just to her, but to himself. "The circuit preacher passes through the settlement on Sunday," he said, his voice low and steady. "He holds a service in the old schoolhouse. If you still hold to your request, we can have it done then." He did not frame it as a question. He stated it as a possibility, leaving the final agency with her. Leanne's expression did not change, but a profound stillness settled over her. This was not a moment of romantic relief or joyful tears. It was a solemn, weighty transaction. She was trading one form of bondage for another, hoping this one would be a shield instead of a cage. She gave a single, slow nod. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible above the crackle of the fire. It was not a marriage of affection, but a pact forged in desperation, a shared alliance against a world that would see them both diminished. Sunday arrived with a sky the color of slate and a wind that promised more snow. The ride to Prairie Creek was tense and silent. Jacob rode his steady gelding while Leanne sat perched on a spare mare, her back as straight as a fence post. She wore the red dress, now clean and meticulously mended. Against the bleak winter landscape, she was a defiant slash of color, a statement of existence that could not be ignored. As they approached the settlement, she seemed to draw into herself, her face becoming an impassive mask. But Jacob could feel the tension radiating from her. The old schoolhouse served as the town's church on Sundays. As they dismounted, every head turned. Conversation ceased. The townspeople, dressed in their sober Sunday best, stared with a mixture of open hostility and righteous curiosity. The air grew thick with their silent judgment. Inside, the chill was palpable. They took a bench at the back, a clear space of emptiness surrounding them as if they carried a contagion. Reverend Miller, a thin man with worried eyes, intercepted Jacob before the service began. He pulled him aside, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "Jacob, you must know what you are doing. The law is one thing, but the word of God. This is an unnatural union. It will bring you nothing but trouble." Jacob looked past the preacher at Leanne, who sat staring straight ahead, her dignity a silent rebuke to the entire room. He then met the preacher's gaze, his own eyes as hard and unyielding as granite. "Reverend," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable weight, "the woman is alone and in need of protection. Does the good book not speak on the virtue of sheltering those in peril? I am asking you to sanctify a shield, not a sin." The preacher flinched at the quiet force of Jacob's conviction, but saw the argument was over. He retreated to his pulpit, his face pale. The service was a strained affair, the sermon on forgiveness ringing hollow in the charged atmosphere. When it came time, Jacob and Leanne stood before the reverend. The words of the ceremony were stark and brief, pronounced into a silence so complete that the hiss of the wood stove sounded like a roar. "I now pronounce you man and wife." The words fell into the room, heavy and final. There were no congratulations, no smiles. As they turned and walked out of the schoolhouse, the collective gaze of the town followed them like a physical force. They were married. The social confrontation had been met, and their exile had officially begun. They were now an island of two, surrounded by a sea of disapproval. The ride back to the ranch was as silent as the ride in, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the tense quiet of uncertainty, but the heavy silence of consequence. They were now bound by law and word, two strangers sharing a name and a roof. Back in the cabin, an awkward new reality settled between them. The space, which had been governed by a simple truce, was now defined by the unspoken rules of a marriage that was not a marriage. Jacob took his few belongings from the built-in bed and moved them to a small cot he set up in the corner, creating a clear and respectful boundary. He was her husband in name, a protector by choice, and he would not presume anything more. The healing, when it began, was not a product of grand gestures or deep conversations. It was built in the small, quiet moments of their shared days. It started with Leanne. One afternoon, as she was helping him feed the chickens, she paused and pointed to the sky. "A hawk," she said softly. "It is looking for mice in the dead grass." It was the first unsolicited observation she had offered, a tiny crack in the wall of her guardedness. Jacob found himself responding in kind. He started telling her the names of his horses, the story of the blizzard that had taken his first herd, the simple grounding facts of his life on this land. These were not confessions, they were offerings, small stones laid one by one to build a bridge across the chasm of their different worlds. One evening she found him staring into the fire, a profound sorrow etched on his face, the ghost of a past loss visiting him in the flames. She did not ask what was wrong. She did not intrude on his private grief. Instead, she quietly brewed a cup of the tea she had brought with her in a small hidden pouch and placed it on the small table beside his chair. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. In that moment, he saw her not as a refugee or a burden he had taken on, but as a person of deep empathy and quiet strength. And she, in turn, saw past his stoic, unbreachable exterior to the decent, lonely man beneath. Trust was being woven, not from words, but from the threads of shared silence, mutual respect, and small, unassuming acts of kindness. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was slowly, cautiously, becoming a home. The fragile peace they were building was shattered by the arrival of a rider. He was not from Prairie Creek. This man was cut from a different cloth, his clothes more suited to the city, his face hard with the kind of authority that comes from enforcing the will of powerful men. He rode a fine black horse and sat in the saddle with an arrogant ease. He reined in just beyond the porch, his eyes sweeping over the small ranch with a look of undisguised contempt. Jacob stepped out of the cabin, positioning himself squarely between the visitor and the door. Leanne watched from the shadows of the window, her body going rigid. The man's name was Finch. He did not bother with pleasantries. "I'm looking for a piece of property that belongs to my employer," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "A Chinese woman, about your height, wearing a red dress. She ran off from San Francisco." He looked directly at Jacob, a smirk playing on his lips. "I'm told she might have found her way here." Jacob's face was impassive. "There's no property here that isn't mine." Finch laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Don't play games with me, rancher. She's a debt, an investment. I have papers. We paid a great deal for her, and my employer wants his investment back. I'm prepared to offer you $200 for your trouble in finding her." The offer was an insult, a clear signal that he saw Jacob as a man whose principles could be bought. Behind the door, Leanne's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the world she had fled, a world of ledgers and price tags, where a human life was a commodity to be traded. Jacob did not move. His hands were loose at his sides, his stance relaxed but rooted to the ground. He was as much a part of this land as the rocks and the sparse grass. "She is my wife," he said, the words spoken with a quiet finality that allowed no room for negotiation. "This is my land. You are not welcome on it." Finch's smirk vanished, replaced by a sneer. "Your wife? The law has a name for that. It's called theft. I'll be back, rancher, and I'll have the county sheriff with me, a man who understands how business is done. You can't hide from the law out here forever." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy, poisonous silence in his wake. The threat was no longer just the whispers of a prejudiced town. It was now a direct, legal, and physical menace. After Finch was gone, the silence that filled the cabin was heavier than any that had come before. The threat was no longer a vague shadow. It had a name and a face. It was the past, come to reclaim its property. Leanne stepped out from the shadows, her face a pale, taut mask of controlled fear. She walked to the table and sat down, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a posture of immense restraint. Jacob closed the door, the sound of the latch clicking into place feeling wholly inadequate against the danger that now loomed. For a long time neither of them spoke. Then Leanne's voice, quiet but steady, cut through the tension. "He is from the man who bought me," she said. It was not a story filled with gruesome details, but a simple, devastating statement of fact. My first husband in this country, he was a merchant. He was not a kind man, but he was old. When he died, his debts were sold. I was part of the sale. She paused, her gaze fixed on the wood grain of the table. I was to be sent to a house in the mountains, for the railroad men. I ran. She finally looked up at him, her eyes dark with a sorrow so deep it seemed bottomless. Yet there was no self-pity in them. You did not ask for this war, Jacob. This is my fight. You can tell him I ran away from here too. He will believe you. He will pay you the money, and you can have your quiet life back. She was offering him an escape. She was giving him back the choice, releasing him from the bond he had made in the cold schoolhouse. It was an act of profound courage, putting his safety above her own. This was the true climax of their story, not in a hail of gunfire, but in this quiet, desperate moment. Jacob looked at her, at this woman who had faced a world of cruelty and had not been broken by it. He thought of the town's judgment, of Finch's smug, greedy face, of the simple decency he had tried to build his life upon. He walked over to the table and stood before her. I did not, he agreed, his voice soft. But I made a choice, in front of God and those people. On this land, a man's word and his name are the only things he truly owns. He reached out, not to touch her, but as a gesture of solidarity, his hand hovering over the table. And you are my wife. The words were a vow, stronger than any spoken before a hesitant preacher. It was a declaration not of ownership, but of partnership. He was no longer just her protector, he was her ally. Her fight was now his fight. For the first time since she had arrived on his land, Leanne's composure broke. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness or fear, but one of profound, cathartic release. She had found an anchor in the storm. They did not know if or when Finch would return, but they did not spend their days paralyzed by fear. Instead, a new purpose settled over the ranch. They prepared, not for a battle with weapons, but for a siege of will. They worked together, their movements falling into a shared, unspoken rhythm. Jacob taught her how to mend a broken section of fence, her small, nimble fingers proving surprisingly adept at wiring the posts together. She, in turn, showed him how to properly salt and cure the last of the autumn's meat, ensuring their supplies would last through the unpredictable end of winter. They were no longer two strangers sharing a space, but a partnership forged in the face of a common threat. Every sunset, they would watch the horizon, a silent vigil for a rider who might appear. But the days bled into a week, and then two, and Finch did not return. The emptiness of the plains, once a symbol of their isolation, now felt like a protective barrier. Perhaps Finch's threat had been a bluff, an attempt to intimidate Jacob into compliance, or perhaps the cost, in time and effort, of retrieving one defiant woman from a determined man on his own remote land was a price his employer was unwilling to pay. The reason did not matter. What mattered was the slow, steady release of tension, like a rope being carefully unknotted. As the threat receded, something else began to take its place. The harsh grip of winter started to loosen. Patches of brown earth appeared through the thinning snow. The air, while still cold, carried the first faint, clean scent of thaw. The change in the season mirrored the change within the cabin's walls. The quiet companionship had deepened into a comfortable, easy silence. The boundaries remained, but they were no longer lines of separation, but markers of mutual respect. One evening they stood together on the small porch, a habit they had fallen into, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the vast sky in hues of orange and purple. The world felt peaceful, settled. Leanne broke the silence, her voice calm and filled with a quiet note of anticipation. "The ground will be soft enough for a garden soon," she said, looking at a small, protected patch of earth near the side of the cabin. It was a statement about the future, a future she now saw herself in, here, on this land. Jacob looked at the same patch of ground, then at her. He saw not the desperate refugee who had collapsed at his fence line, but a resilient, capable partner. He saw the home they had inadvertently built together, a sanctuary founded not on passion, but on a shared commitment to dignity and courage. He gave a small, slow nod. "Yes," he said, "it will." The simple exchange was a promise. Their union had begun as a stark contract for survival, a desperate choice between death and obligation. But through shared hardship and unwavering moral courage, it had been transformed into something more, an earned peace, a quiet hope, a partnership ready to plant roots in the thawing soil.